Welcome to All Things Storybound, a creative outlet where any and all kinds of stories come to life.
From magical to mythical to mortifying, let us take you on a journey you've never experienced before.
Grab your favorite drink and get comfortable. You're in for a wild story ahead. Chapter 1. The town of Willow Creek was as quiet as it was unremarkable, nestled between the rolling hills of the Appalachian Mountains. Its people were a simple folk, living their lives with a comforting routine that had gone uninterrupted for generations. But that peace was shattered one crisp autumn morning when old Miss Tilly Jenkins was found dead in her bed. Sheriff Ben Granger arrived at the scene shortly after dawn, his boots crunching on the gravel outside the Jenkins farmhouse. He'd been the sheriff of Willow Creek for over 20 years, and in all that time, he'd never seen anything like this. Mrs. Jenkins, a widow who lived alone since her husband passed a decade ago, was known to everyone in town. She was a sweet old lady, always baking pies for the church bake sale or knitting scarves for the children. Her death, by itself, wouldn't have been surprising. She was well into her 80s after all. But the manner of it was what had people talking. Ben pushed open the creaky front door. The smell of something rotten immediately hit in his nostrils. He steeled himself, pulling out a handkerchief to cover his nose as he entered the dimly lit bedroom. Mrs. Jenkins lay in her bed, her face twisted in a grotesque mask of pain. Her hands were gnawed at the sheets as if she tried to fight off something or someone. But what made Ben's blood run cold was the expression frozen on her face, a mix of terror and confusion as if she had seen the devil himself before she died. There was no sign of forced entry, no struggle other than the woman's own desperate attempts to resist whatever fate had befallen her. The coroner, Dr. Ellison, was already there, his face grim as he examined the body. "What do you make of it, Doc?" Ben asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Dr. Ellison shook his head, his usual calm demeanor shaken.
Heart attack, maybe. But the expression on her face, I've never seen anything like it, Ben. It's as if something scared her to death.
Ben nodded, though he felt a gnawing unease in his gut. "I'll have the deputies start asking around, see if anyone saw anything unusual." But there was nothing. No one had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary. Mrs. Jenkins had gone to bed as usual, and in the morning she was dead. The people of Willow Creek whispered about it in hushed tones, but life went on as it always did. Chapter 2. Weeks passed, and the town began to move on from the strange death of Mrs. Jenkins. The leaves turned from green to gold, and the air grew colder as fall settled in. But the peace was not to last. The next victim was Robert Parsons, a farmer who lived on the outskirts of town. He was found in the barn, hanging from a rafter with a rope made of barbed wire. It was a grisly sight, one that Sheriff Ben Granger would never forget. Ben stood in the doorway of the barn, staring up at the body swaying gently in the breeze. Robert had been a strong man, not the sort to take his own life, but the way he'd been found, it was hard to see it as anything else. "What the hell is going on in this town?" Deputy Pete Miller muttered, his face pale. Ben didn't answer, but his mind was racing. Two deaths, both inexplicable, both with the look of terror on their faces. It was as if something was haunting Willow Creek, something evil. "We'll need to cut him down, Sheriff," Pete said after a moment. "Can't leave him hanging like that." Ben nodded, his mouth dry. He turned away, letting the deputies handle the body while he went back to his patrol car to think. Two deaths. Two deaths that didn't make any sense. His instincts were screaming at him that there was something more to this. Something dark and twisted that he couldn't yet see. He spent the next few days interviewing everyone who had known Robert. The man had been well liked, respected even. No enemies, no debts, no reason for anyone to want him dead. Yet dead he was, in the most brutal way imaginable. The townsfolk were scared now, more scared than they'd been after Mrs. Jenkins. One death could be explained away, but two? Two was a pattern. Ben knew he had to find out what was happening before it got any worse. Chapter 3. It got worse. Less than a week after Robert Parsons was buried, the body of Mary Lou Hastings was found in the woods outside of town. She had been out picking wildflowers, something she did every Sunday morning, but this Sunday she didn't come home. Her husband Frank went out looking for her when she didn't return by noon. He found her in a clearing, her throat slashed from ear to ear. The flowers she had picked were scattered around her body, soaked in her blood. Sheriff Granger arrived at the scene with his heart pounding in his chest. Mary Lou had been young, only 25, with her whole life ahead of her. Now she was just another victim and was quickly becoming the worst killing spree Willow Creek had ever seen. Dear God, Deputy Miller whispered as he stood over the body. Who could do something like this? Ben didn't answer. He was too busy looking at the scene, trying to find something, anything, that would make sense of it all. But there was nothing. No footprints, no fingerprints, no sign of a struggle. Just the body of a young woman brutally murdered for no apparent reason. He felt the eyes of the townfolk on him as he returned to his car. They were looking to him for answers, for reassurances that they were safe. But Ben didn't have any answers. All he had was a growing sense of dread that whoever was doing this wasn't going to stop. Chapter 4. The murders cast a long shadow over Willow Creek. People started locking their doors at night, something that they'd never done before. Children were kept inside, and no one went out after dark. The town was gripped by fear, and that fear was beginning to turn to suspicion. Ben could feel it every time he walked down the street. People were looking at each other differently, wondering if their neighbor could be the killer. Rumors starting to spread, whispers of old grudges, secret affairs, and dark past. Ben knew that he had to solve this case before the town tore itself apart. He doubled his efforts, working late into the night, going over every piece of evidence again and again. But there was nothing. No motive, no suspects, no clues. It was as if the killer was a ghost, slipping in and out of the town's collective consciousness, leaving only death in his wake. Ben started to have nightmares. In them, he was always chasing someone through the woods, but no matter how fast he ran, he could never catch up. He would wake up in a cold sweat, the image of Mary Lou's lifeless body burned into his mind. One night, after a particularly bad dream, he decided to go for a drive to clear his head. The town was quiet as he cruised down the empty streets. The only sound was the rumble of his engine. He didn't have a destination in mind, just a need to get away from the suffocating fear that was choking the life out of Willow Creek. As he drove, he found himself heading out towards the Jenkins farmhouse. It was a place he had avoided since the day Mrs. Jenkins was found, but something was pulling him there now. He didn't know what it was, just that he needed to see it again. The farmhouse was dark when he arrived, the windows like empty eyes staring out into the night. Ben parked his car and got out, the cool night air sending a shiver down his spine. He walked up to the front door, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to find, but when he opened the door, the house was just as it had been the last time he was there. Everything was in its place, the furniture gathering dust, the air thick with the smell of decay. He walked through the house slowly, his footsteps echoing in the silence. When he reached the bedroom, he stopped in the doorway, staring at the bed where Mrs. Jenkins had died. He could still see her face, twisted in that mask of terror. And then, for the first time, he noticed something. The bed, which had been neatly made the day he found her, was now slightly rumpled, as if someone had been laying on it recently. Ben's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't been back in the house since the day, and as far as he knew, no one else had either. He reached for his gun, his fingers brushing the cold metal as he turned to leave. But before he could take a step, he heard a noise behind him. A creak, barely audible, but enough to make his blood run cold. He spun around, his gun drawn, but there was no one there. The house was empty, just as it had been when he arrived, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Ben backed out of the room, his eyes scanning every shadow, every corner, until he was out the front door and back in his car. He drove away, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing. Something was wrong, very wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The house had been empty, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been there with him. The image of the rumpled sheets playing over in his mind. Why hadn't he noticed it before? What did it mean? Back at the station, Ben sat in his office staring at the walls. He was exhausted, but sleep was the furthest thing from his mind. He sifted through the files on his desk, going over the details of each murder once again, searching for anything he might have missed. But the more he looked, the more elusive the truth became. The phone rang, cutting through the silence, and he grabbed it, grateful for the distraction. Sheriff Granger. he answered, his voice rough.
Ben, it's Doc Ellison.
The coroner's voice was tense.
I've been going over the autopsy reports again, and I found something that didn't make sense to me at first, but now I think I might know what we're dealing with.
Ben sat up straighter, his pulse quickening. What is it?
There's a pattern.
Ellison said.
A subtle one, but it's there. The victims, they all had high levels of adrenaline in their systems, like they were all terrified out of their minds before they died. And there's something else. All of them had traces of a substance in their blood, something I couldn't identify at first. But then I remembered a case from years ago, back when I was just starting out.
Ben frowned, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. What kind of substance?
It's an extract from a rare plant, something almost no one knows about anymore. It causes intense hallucinations, fear, and ultimately death. The plant's called devil's breath. It was used by certain cults and ancient civilizations in rituals, said to bring out the darkest fears in a person, drive them mad.
Ben's heart raced. You think someone's been using this on the victims?
I do.
Ellison replied, his voice grim.
But here's the thing, Ben. This isn't something you can just pick up at the local store. Whoever's doing this knows what they're doing. They're playing with people's minds, using their deepest fears against them.
A cold dread settled in Ben's gut. He thought of the victims, their faces twisted in terror, the bizarre circumstances of their deaths. If what Ellison was saying was true, the killer was more than just a murderer. He was a monster, someone who reveled in causing pain and fear. Thanks, Doc, Ben said quietly. I'll look into it. He hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. Devil's breath. It sounded like something out of a horror story, but this was real. And the killer was still out there, watching, waiting for his next victim. Ben knew he had to act fast, but he didn't know where to start. The town was already on edge, and if word got out about this, it would only make things worse. He needed to keep a lid on it, at least until he had more information. Chapter 5. As the days passed, the tension in Willow Creek grew unbearable. The townsfolk were on the brink of hysteria, each new day bringing fresh rumors and wild theories. Ben did his best to keep the peace, but it was clear that people were losing faith in him. They wanted answers, and he had none to give. And then, just as things seemed like they couldn't get any worse, they did. Another body was found. This time, it was Deputy Pete Miller. Ben got the call in the middle of the night. He arrived at Pete's house to find the place in chaos. Neighbors had gathered outside, their faces pale and frightened. Ben pushed through the crowd, his heart in his throat. Ben's wife, Sarah, was standing on the porch, her face streaked with tears.
Ben?
She sobbed, clutching at his arm.
It's Pete.
Where is he? Ben asked, his voice tight. She pointed towards the barn behind the house, her hand shaken.
In there. I found him.
Ben felt a surge of anger and grief as he made his way to the barn. P had been his friend, his right-hand man. Whoever had done this was going to pay. He pushed open the barn door, his breath catching in his throat as he saw Pete's body. The scene was eerily similar to Robert Parsons' death. P was hanging from a rafter, his face twisted in horror. But there was something different this time. Ben's eyes were drawn to the ground beneath Pete's feet. Scrawled in the dirt in what looked like blood were the words, "The devil walks among you." Ben's blood ran cold. The message was clear. The killer was taunting him, daring him to find him. But what chilled Ben even more was the implication of the words. Was the killer someone he knew? Someone he trusted? He turned away from the body, his mind racing. Pete's death was a message. A warning that no one was safe, not even the closest to Ben. The killer was playing a sick game, and Ben was the unwitting pawn. Chapter 6. Days turned into weeks, and the murders continued. Each time the killer left a new message, each one more cryptic and disturbing than the last. The town was in a state of panic, with people locking themselves in their home, too afraid to go outside. Ben was at his breaking point. He hadn't slept in days, his mind a constant whirl of fear and paranoia. He could feel the weight of the town's eyes on him, accusing him of failing to protect them. But how could he protect them when he didn't even know who or what he was up against? One night, after a long day of fruitless searching, Ben found himself back at the Jenkins farmhouse. He hadn't been there since the night he felt someone watching him, but something was drawing him back now, an irresistible pull he couldn't ignore. The night was cool and still as he parked his patrol car outside the farmhouse. The moon cast long shadows across the ground, and the house loomed before him, dark and silent. Ben stood by the car for a moment, staring up at the building. There was something about this place, something that called to him, whispering secrets that he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. With a deep breath, he made his way to the front door, the wooden boards creaking under his weight. The door was unlocked, just as it had been before, and it swung open easily as he pushed it. The smell of dust and decay filled his nostrils as he stepped inside, the darkness closing in around him. He was halfway through the living room when he heard a noise behind him, a soft creak, like the sound of a floorboard under pressure. Ben spun around, his hand instinctively going to his gun, but he relaxed when he saw who it was. "Doc?" Ben's voice was surprised, though tinged with unease. "What are you doing here?" Dr. Ellison stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable.
I could ask you the same thing, Ben. I saw your car out front and thought I'd see what you were up to.
Ben let out a shaky breath, lowering his hand from his weapon. "I don't know. Something just pulled me back here. I couldn't stay away." Ellison nodded slowly, stepping further into the room.
I've been doing some more thinking about what we discussed. The devil's breath, the hallucinations. There's something going on here, Ben. Something we need to figure out.
Ben looked at the coroner, his mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. Something in Ellison's eyes made him uneasy, as if the older man knew more than he was letting on. "Yeah, we do," Ben agreed, though his voice lacked conviction. He could feel the darkness pressing in on him, that same unsettling feeling he'd had the last time he was here. "But why'd you come here, Doc? This place, it's not right."
I came here because I think you know more than you're letting on, Ben. There's something you're not telling me. Something you've been keeping from yourself.
Ben froze, his heart skipping a beat. "What are you talking about?"
The victims, Ben. The fear, the terror. It's not just random. Someone knew them. Someone knew how to get inside their heads, how to bring out their worst fears. And I think that someone is standing right in front of me.
For a moment, Ben couldn't breathe. The room seemed to spin around him, the walls closing in. He stared at Ellison, a cold, calm clarity settled over him. Washing away the fear and doubt, he knew what he had to do. "You're right, Doc," Ben said, his voice eerily steady. "I've been keeping something from you, from everyone." Ellison's eyes widened in realization, but before he could react, Ben moved. In one swift motion, he pulled out his gun, leveling it at the corner.
Ben, don't do this.
Ellison whispered, his voice trembling. But Ben was beyond reason now. He felt a strange sense of peace as he pulled the trigger, the sound of the gunshot echoing through the empty house. Ellison crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him as the light faded from his eyes. Ben stood over the body, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was silent now, save for the faint ringing in his ears. He felt nothing. No guilt, no remorse, just a cold satisfaction. The darkness that had been lurking inside him for so long had finally taken control, and there was no turning back. He knelt down beside Ellison's lifeless form, wiping the blood from his gun. As he did, a smile crept across his face, a smile that held no warmth, no humanity. It was the smile of a man who had embraced the monster within. Rising to his feet, Ben looked around the room one last time. The farmhouse, the scene of so much death and terror, now felt like home. He knew what he was now, what he had always been, a hunter, a predator hiding in plain sight. And as he walked out of the house, leaving Dr. Ellison's body behind, he knew that his work was far from over. There were others out there, others who would soon learn the true meaning of fear. The devil had walked among them, and now he was free.